Ramesses II does not know it yet, but he already senses that this will be his last said festival, the ritual in which the pharaohs renewed their life force and symbolically established order throughout Egypt. Priests and envoys from all parts of the kingdom watch him and assume that he does not have much time left for one of the longest lived pharaohs in history. However, the old pharaoh, close to 90 years of age, continues with the ritual, showing a willpower far superior to his physical capabilities. He has already experienced much worse situations during his campaigns in Libya, in Kush and in Asia, where he almost died at the hands of the Hittite army. He was also lost more than 12 successors who could not cope with the passage of time. But not everything has been conflict throughout his reign. Ramesses took great pains to capture the greatness of Egypt in monumental works of architecture. In all the extension of the Nile, he ordered to build temples dedicated to the gods, especially in the capital Thebes. He even moved his capital to a city in the north of the territory, Ramesses, to control the conquests in the Levant. Throughout the 66 years of his government, he faced different threats to strengthen the borders of his kingdom, and once consolidated, he was responsible for making some of the most impressive works of antiquity: warrior, architect, god. This is the story of Ramesses II, the Great. It is difficult to know how many years Ramesses II's father, Seti I, reigned, since there are not many sources about it. However, Ramesses himself was in charge of establishing that when he was only 14 years old. His father had appointed him as co-regent. Probably this is an exaggeration of Ramesses himself to legitimize his story, but it is true that during this period he had important responsibilities, especially on the battlefield, where he had to face the Nubians in the southern border as commander-in-chief of the royal armies, and showing the warlike character that the first part of his reign was going to have. At the age of 24, in 1279 BC, his father died and he was finally crowned as pharaoh. Soon after, he was fighting a group of pirates called Sheridan, whom he later included in his personal guard. Undoubtedly, the great event of his reign took place in the 4th year of his government, in which he directed his forces to Syria to confront the Hittite kingdom that was in a period of expansion. Thus, it came one of the largest battles in the history of antiquity between two states that sought to conquer the same territory and had military forces similar in size and power. His father, Seti I, had already faced Suppiluliuma in the Levant, and although he had managed to capture some important cities such as Kadesh or Amurru, he had not managed to maintain control in the area, and the Hittites quickly established themselves in the area. This region was extremely important for the states of the time. First of all, it was the centre of the trade routes connecting the different cultures of antiquity. To the east, there was Cyprus, Crete and mainland Greece. To the west were the ancient Sumerian cities in Lower Mesopotamia, and behind the Zagros Mountains, the Iranian area. Further north, the Assyrian territories bordered the Hittite Empire, which occupied that region and almost the entire Anatolian peninsula. In addition, there were a large number of copper and tin mines, essential for the production of bronze tools and weapons. Secondly, this area was politically strategic to ensure that the products of the area were directed towards the most powerful state. Likewise, the cities of the Levant had a large amount of wealth that could be attained through tributes. For this reason, the empires of the time tried to control this region, even though it was far from the heart of their states. In this way, we can understand the strategic decision of Ramesses to move his capital to Ramesses. It was on the western part of the Nile Delta, and he could launch his military campaigns from there. Although there are not so many archaeological remains of the city, it is known that it had a system of canals between the buildings, which earned it the title, among some scholars, as the Venice of the Nile. It also had a central lagoon, a large number of temples, and the palace of the pharaoh. To face Muwatalli II, Ramesses divided his army into 4 divisions, each of them under the name of a god. Ammon was the protective god of the division that had been recruited in Thebes and was at the forefront of his army. From Heliopolis, one of the most important cities, came the armies of Ra, and was in second place in the march to Kadesh. The armies of Memphis had their main god Ptah under his auspices, and trailed behind the divisions of Ra. And finally, in the rear, the armies of Ramesses, who were under the protection of Set, god of chaos. In total, the Egyptian forces grouped between 16,000 and 20,000 people, who were divided between the cavalry that had light chariots for 2 people, a charioteer and an archer who would make up the heavy cavalry and the main force of the Egyptians. These soldiers had a more rigorous training than the rest, and the best of them fought alongside the pharaoh. The professional infantry, Menfit, made up the heavy infantry, and were also among the most important fighters in the army. They often came from noble families, and were well trained in the use of the famous Egyptian curved sword, the khepesh, although they could also use hammers, axes, and spears. Complementing this were soldiers recruited through the levy, called Nefru, who came from all over Egypt and fought as part of their duties to the pharaoh. These fighters usually fought with spears and had lighter protection. Archers were also very important for the army, since they used a compound bow that allowed them to shoot arrows at long distances, and their training was usually easier. This body of the army became professionalized over time by the continuous wars that Egypt had before and during the rule of Ramesses. Finally, the Egyptians had a large number of auxiliary forces from other nearby areas. For example, there were mercenary soldiers from Libya and Nubia who received goods in exchange for fighting for the pharaoh's forces. Another important group were the warriors of the tribes from the eastern Mediterranean, who often received land in exchange for settling within the Kingdom of Egypt. It is difficult to know the number of Hittite troops, since most of the sources that survive until today are Egyptian. However, it is likely that they had a very large force. It is known that the main Hittite weapon was also the chariot, but the difference is that they were larger and heavier, because they were carried by 3 people: the charioteer, the archer, and a squire who protected them from enemy arrows. This war technique was adapted after their contact with the Mitanni people, who used the chariot to fight in the northern plains of Mesopotamia. The change that the Hittites included was the incorporation of bronze armour, since in Anatolia they had a great quantity of metals available. This advantage allowed them to quickly conquer many regions of Mesopotamia and incorporate soldiers from these areas to their army. In addition, the Hittite king had to prove his bravery on the battlefield, so he made war one of his main concerns. In this exercise, he was accompanied by the royal family and the nobles, since every time a territory was conquered, a person close to the king was put in charge of controlling the area and recruiting troops. The nobility, therefore, also had to prove their bravery on the battlefield and made up the best trained units. Given the diversity of troops from very dissimilar areas, the Hittites had a strict military discipline with well-established hierarchies that began with the king and branched out among the trusted nobles and the generals of allied troops and mercenaries. As for weaponry, there are archaeological remains of spears, swords, and axes, although there is also literary evidence of specialised corps such as the Meshedi or Men of the Golden Swords, who were the king's personal guard. However, the key to this confrontation was not so much the number of men on the battlefield, but the intelligence and counterintelligence strategies of the political leaders before the direct fight. Days before the confrontation, Ramesses' troops captured some Bedouins who informed them that the king of Hittite was to the north, far from their positions. Faced with this, the pharaoh decided to establish his camp near the city of Kadesh, since he thought he had a better control of the battlefield. However, these Bedouins had lied to Ramesses, and in reality, Muwatalli was hiding with a large part of his army on the other side of the city. The Egyptian monarch received this information moments before the fight after capturing some Hittite spies who were close to his camp. At that time, he decided to send messages to the contingents of Ra and Ptah to rush to assist them in the face of numerical inequality. In the same way, he sent messages to the north to ask for the help of some foreign auxiliary forces that were loyal to them. Luck did not seem to be on the side of Ramesses, since the divisions of Ra were surprised by their flanks by a group of Hittite chariots that had been sent to explore the area. The attack was brutal and almost all of Ra's division was eliminated, although some chariots and part of the heavy infantry were able to reach Ramesses' camp. Behind them, they were pursued by the Hittite troops, who ventured against the Egyptian camp that was quickly trying to organise a defence. The Hittite victory seemed total, but the tents and the elements that were scattered on the ground did not allow the Hittite chariots to enter the heart of the camp, although they came close to capturing the royal family. In addition, the Hittite soldiers themselves, seeing that the victory was absolute, began to loot the riches of the tents, unconcerned about finishing the battle. At that moment, the infantry and the personal guard of the pharaoh managed to rearm, and since the Hittite chariots could not move, they began to attack them, taking them by the long hair and killing them instantly. At this moment of defence, Ramesses himself took command of the cavalry that remained of the divisions of Amun and Ra, commanded a counterattack with his chariots to the rest of the Hittite army, generating panic among the enemy troops. But the battle was far from over. While Ramesses and his troops chased the fleeing Hittite chariots, the rest of Muwatalli's troops assaulted the camp again, and once again, the royal family was close to being taken prisoner. However, the allied troops from the north arrived at that moment and attacked the unprotected Hittite army that ended up withdrawing, but in an organised way. The next day, Ramesses attacked the city of Kadesh, killing a large part of its population. But despite being victorious, his triumph was not total, since he had to stop a series of revolts in the cities of the Levant. At the moment that he started his way to the south, Muwatalli reconquered the lands that had generated so many problems. Years later, Ramesses II and Murasili III, son of Muwatalli II, signed one of the oldest peace treaties in history, in which both empires committed to a non-aggression pact and exchanged women from both royal families to be married to the respective monarchs. The Hittite king even took refuge in the court of Ramesses after his uncle Hattusili III removed him from the throne. In the later years, Ramesses was responsible for securing the borders of the Egyptian Empire through a series of fortresses to protect against attacks from the Libyans and the Nubians to the south. However, the remaining years of his reign, he had the mission to do a large number of architectural works in the most important cities of the empire, especially in Thebes, the capital of the previous dynasties. There, he made substantial changes to the Temple of Luxor, in which he added a courtyard with peristyle and a monumental gate of 24 meters high, in which there were 6 monumental statues representing him. On the western bank of the Nile River, where the necropolis known as the Valley of the Kings was located, Ramesses built his funerary tomb, the House of a Million Years, which Champollion called Ramesseum. In it, there were 2 large entrances and 2 statues of Ramesses seated approximately 17 meters, one of black granite and one of pink granite. The columns were shaped like papyrus and supported a dark blue painted ceiling depicting the night sky with golden stars. On its walls were the reliefs that describe the Battle of Kadesh and which constitute one of the most important historical sources to reconstruct this event, although with the extenuating circumstances that it has a laudatory perspective for Ramesses II. For this reason, it is necessary to be very cautious at the time of considering totally certain the facts that there are narrated, given that they show an overvaluation of the person of the pharaoh. Finally, another of the important works of this monarch are the temples located in Abu Simbel, Nubia, outside the traditional area of Egypt. These temples were dedicated to Ramesses and his wife Nefertari, and also served to commemorate the Battle of Kadesh, which shows the importance that had for Ramesses this warlike confrontation. These temples are carved into the rock and were also dedicated to the worship of Amun, Ra and Ptah, the traditional gods of Thebes. In addition to its impressive size of 30 meters high and 38 meters wide, these constructions had the function of consolidating the conquests of Egypt in the south to try to dominate that territory. Thus, the inhabitants of the area would find, on the facade, 4 statues representing Ramesses seated of 22 meters high. Inside the temple, there were also representations of Nubian prisoners that served to send a message to Egypt's power over the area. The other important temple, dedicated to Nefertari, has 6 statues of 10 meters high, in which Ramesses is represented with different royal attributes, and his wife with the characteristics of Hathor, the goddess of fertility. Finally, the end came for one of the longest-lived pharaohs in history. In the year 1213 BC, Ramesses II died at the age of about 90 years. The cause of death is not well known, but studies on his mummy were able to identify a series of health problems that must have been very annoying for a person over 80 years old at a time when there were no painkillers. Basically, the knowledge we have comes from the study of his bones, so it is possible to determine that he suffered from severe arthritis, which would have made him walk with a curved gait during the last years of his life. Additionally, his skull shows signs of infections in the molars, and the rest of his body seems to have had many scars from his participation in battles. Finally, his arteries would have hardened, causing poor blood circulation and deepening all his health problems. After his death, Ramesses II was mummified according to Egyptian tradition. This ritual was carried out to preserve the body for the afterlife. Each of the steps performed had a very important religious value, especially for the pharaohs, since they were considered gods. To avoid the decomposition of the body, it was placed on a table and the organs were removed, and they were proceeded to remove the organs to avoid decomposition. According to Herodotus, the brain was first removed by striking it through the nose. Then, an incision was made in the abdomen with a ritual knife through which the digestive organs were removed. The emptied cavities were cleaned with wine and an herbal infusion and filled with aromatic herbs. Then, the lungs were removed, avoiding damage to the heart, which was the only thing that remained in the body. According to the Egyptian religion, the heart contained the soul and had to remain in the body because it would later be weighed by the goddess Mart as a way of judging the dead. All the organs were placed in ceramic vessels called canomorenojj jars. Each of them represented one of the 4 sons of Horus. In Kabessenuth, the intestines were kept. In Hapi, the lungs. In Domutef, the stomach. In Imseti, the liver. Then, for 40 days, the body was covered with natron or nedri, a natural mixture of salts that killed the living organisms, decreased the body and dissected it. After that time, the natron was removed and the body was cleaned again with aromatic oils and herbs. To better preserve the body, it was smeared with a yellowish coloured resin that worked as an antibacterial product and also gave the body a golden hue, which gave it a religious value. Subsequently, the body was covered with balsams and resins, and small gold objects were placed to cover the wounds of the mummification process. Finally, the whole body was wrapped with strips of linen and small amulets were added to protect it. Although this concluded the mummification process, the funerary rituals continued, since a sarcophagus had to be made in which to deposit the mummified body. In the case of the pharaoh, this sarcophagus represented his idealized form with all the standards. Then, the sarcophagus was taken to the tomb in a procession which participated the Falcons of Nephthys, which was a group of women who cried accompanying the sarcophagus to entrance of this tomb. Finally, a priest performed the rite of the opening of the mouth to bring the pharaoh's body back to life, and it was deposited in the tomb with a large trousseau. After his death, Ramesses II had conquered large and rich territories in the north and south of Egypt, had carried out a great constructive work in all his domains, but with a special emphasis on Thebes, the traditional capital of the kingdom. He also built the city of Pi-Ramesses and restored many traditional cults that were passing into oblivion. It is true that Ramesses II despoiled some earlier monuments to put his name on the places with greater symbolic value, but his 66 years of reign made him a legend, even during the end of his life. It is time to finish the video. All illustrations and animations are made by us, so I would be very grateful that if you liked it, please like and subscribe so we can continue making many more videos of the same quality or higher. Thank you all very much, and see you in the next video.